Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your patience. Combination of the rainy weather and an unforeseen traffic congestion in town proved not to be too kind to our planning, but 10 minutes, here we are. An evening like this requires a warm welcome, so let me oblige and extend a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for not letting you be deterred by the weather outside and for joining us for a very special event here at STIAS. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Professor Manuel Castells into the STIAS fold. He's now with us for the fourth time since he started to make common cause with the STIAS program in 2009. Professor Castells is among a handful of researchers who have the status of permanent visiting fellow at STIAS, which in short means that he calls us rather than the other way around. So at the beginning of this year, he indeed called to explore the possibility of working at STIAS on a project which deals with national identities and state formation, which provides the background to his lecture this evening on Rupture, the global crisis of liberal democracy, Trump, Brexit, and beyond. So we all know that since Professor Castells' last visit to STIAS, the global political situation has taken a remarkable, if rather disconcerting, turn to the right. And we look forward to Professor Castells' usual razor-sharp and data-driven analysis to help us make sense of it. So Manuel, a hearty welcome back to STIAS. Before we ask you to present your lecture, Professor Johan Multon will briefly introduce you. Thank you.
Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm under very clear instructions from Professor Castells to keep it very short, the introduction. In addition to that, I made the mistake of going into Wikipedia to see what they say about Professor Castells. I showed him that. In 5 minutes, he showed me 3 mistakes on his Wikipedia entry. The one that I found most interesting is in Wikipedia, it says that between 1967 and 1977, he was at Paris University, and the university fired him because of his involvement in the 1968 student protest. And Manuel said to me, no, that's already factually incorrect. The government expelled him from the country, the university didn't fire him. So you will appreciate, you have seen his very comprehensive CV. You now know not to trust Wikipedia. Well, we kind of knew that anyway beforehand. Just to make 2 or 3 very broad points. One is that he is currently a professor at the University of Southern California. He also has joint appointments at UC Berkeley and elsewhere. He's a fellow of Cambridge and Oxford. And then the one thing which struck me when I went through his CV again is that in 2012 he was the recipient of the Holzberg Prize, which is generally regarded in the social sciences and humanities as the Nobel Prize for social sciences and humanities. And if you look through the other list of recipients of that prize, you will see the names of Jürgen Habermas, Julia Kristeva, a whole range of really very prominent people, Richard Dworkin. So, I mean, it just gives you an indication of the standing in which he is held amongst his peers. So it really is a very great privilege and pleasure for me to introduce him, to address us this evening on the global crisis of liberal democracy, Trump, Brexit, and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Henrik. Let me first to thank all of you. I'm very grateful that you came here braving the storm. I hope not to disappoint you. I know you will stay as long as you can because there's a storm outside. So when you made it here, it's safe. I just want to take 1 minute to say how happy I am to be again at STIAS and in Stellenbosch. I have been coming for a number of years, actually since the year 2000, before STIAS. And I particularly want to thank for their interest and friendship my friends here, particularly Maria Mouton, Nico Klute, Bernard Latehan, and Paul Kluber, who is trying to hide, but is my dear friend. I also want to acknowledge the presence in the lecture of the STIAS Fellows, who are my colleagues and who we support each other and interact with each other intellectually. Thank all of you for coming. The tradition I have at STIAS and more broadly at Stellenbosch University is that every year when I come, I talk for the first time about my new book, not yet published. This lecture, in fact, it's a synthesis and elaboration on the book that will be published in September by Polity Press of Cambridge under the title of this conference, Rupture, the Crisis of Liberal Democracy. And the reason I mention that is also a very practical reason. I will not spend time giving you all the statistics and references that back my analysis, for a very simple reason that in the internet age, all these can be easily found in the internet. But of course organized. And that's what now, currently my publishing strategy is when I publish a book, it's a requirement for the publishing house to set up a web, which is a companion web to the book that is referred with a URL in the book, and then you can go into the web and look at all the tables and all the references, etc. So we save some forest in the planet. So for all those of you who would be interested in looking at the empirical foundations of what I'm going to do, you can check it, Polity Press, September, the web that will go with the Rupture book under my authorship. Now, let's then go into the content of the lecture. I specialize in the analysis of crisis, all kinds of crises, social crisis, financial crisis, environmental crisis, political crisis, etc. And I having done this for about my entire life, but particularly in the last 20 years, I decided that the most serious crisis of the world, and we are in the midst of some totally self-destructive process, including the environmental crisis that doesn't in fact jeopardize the planet, as people say, jeopardizes us and the planet. The planet will be happy without us. And terrorism and destruction of human values and treating refugees as human flesh, as the Italian Interior Minister said. All these are terrible dramas, human dramas. However, the worst crisis of all for me is the crisis of the political institutions and the crisis of the trust by citizens around the world in their institutions. Because if we don't have that, we don't have the instrument to manage any crisis. It's the crisis of crisis management. That's the most serious one. And it refers to the gradual collapse of a model of democracy, which after fights and sweat and tears and blood, more or less took place and took hold in the world in the last decade, depending on countries. You can start one way or another, South Africa in '94, and so on. So this model is to some extent responded to the ideals of people about living in democracy around the world. And as an ideal, democracy still lives in the minds of the people all over the world. But as actually experienced in their lives, this ideal is dying in the minds of the majority of the people in the world. Because institutions only persist if they remain legitimate in the minds of the people. This is the place for legitimacy. Only we think that our governments are democratic, they are democratic. And now, this crisis of legitimacy, as we call it in social sciences, takes place in many different countries, in many different contexts, in many different economic, political, cultural environments, and all over the world. And therefore, if that is the case, it is not only in a few countries and under certain conditions, means that the model itself is collapsing, methodologically speaking. What is happening now, empirically, very quickly on some empirical indications, but again, the data you can check it, globally, over 2/3 of citizens in the world do not feel represented by their governments, parliaments, or political parties. And this includes the European Union and North America. Overwhelmingly, like 80%, citizens think politicians work for themselves and not for the people. Politicians are universally despised, regardless of their political affiliation. In the ranking of occupational prestige, in every survey in the world, the last dead one is politicians. Actually, in Italy, at one point 7 years ago, they included prostitutes and mafiosi, and they did better, and people explain, at least they say what they do. The media are not trusted, in general terms. The legal system and the judiciary are usually, not always, but usually, not considered reliable. Only the armed forces are respected, and not in all countries. Established churches are in deep decline, particularly the Catholic Church, and particularly in Latin America. It's being replaced by a constellation of what I call evangelical startups, which are taking increasingly market shares of religion. While religion in the world, religion and the religious feeling is expanding quite substantially everywhere, but not through the established churches. And that you can see like the same way in which political institutions are not trusted, but people are deeply interested in politics, more and more interested in politics. And it's actually one of the reasons that institutions are not trusted, because people are involved. Financial institutions are universally suspected. So look, we don't trust the people to whom we delegate our votes and we give our money. That's quite serious. And these trends have increased significantly in the last decade. In South Africa, by the way, there's not part of my analysis here, but in South Africa, according to the Edelman Barometer 2017, which is much better than the African barometer, only 15% of citizens trust the government. 15%. And is the lowest percentage of the 28 countries that have been surveyed in 2017. Now, sure, these data are from public opinion surveys, serious public opinion surveys. One could say, well, yes, okay, this is what people think, but then they do other things. They do other things. Well, exactly that's what I tried to say. The actual political processes and political behavior in every country in the last 5 to 10 years follows exactly the pattern of what these public opinion surveys reflect. That's what explains major developments, practical major developments. Election of Trump, Brexit, and the beginning of the crisis of the European Union, the election of a neo-fascist government in Italy, the consolidation of authoritarian nationalist extreme right regimes in Eastern Europe, Poland particularly, but also Hungary with Viktor Orban. And I'm not counting here Putin and Russia or China, Why? Because they don't pretend to be democracies. And that's exactly the point. And actually, in both countries, there is more support to the government than in any other democracy. That's another worrisome development. The systems that are working relatively efficiently, not well, but efficiently, are authoritarian regimes, not democratic authoritarian. Those who don't even care about saying they are democracies. In South Africa, yes, well, by the way, in Latin America, Brazil is collapsing, and Mexico largely has collapsed, except that 2 weeks ago there was a new president elected, and we'll see what happens. In South Africa, again, I'm not going to analyze, but it's just for you to see that you are not a special case. Everybody thinks a special case until you start putting everything together, and oh, really? Well, I didn't know. Well, yeah, we are all in that, in the same situation. In South Africa, there is a gradual loss of legitimacy, as I told you, but this has had practical consequences. The gradual collapse of the control of the historic ANC, that at this point has already lost the municipalities of all the major cities in South Africa. And the growing influence of the radical movement led by Malema, not major electoral force yet, about 8% I believe, but growing influence and impact, particularly in the minds of the young people. And of course, all this opinion ended up in the forced resignation of your President Zuma under the pressure of his own party. So these opinions, these attitudes translate into major political developments in every country in the world. Now, to try to understand that, one traditional method in social sciences is to take some exemplary cases or cases that could be highlighted for having specific impact that modifies the institutional landscape. So I will then briefly analyze the reasons for the election of Trump as President of the United States, how it happened exactly, empirically. I will not discuss the policies, we can discuss policies later. But I'm interested now here with you to share my analysis of why it happened. And then I will do the same much more briefly with Brexit in the UK. And then I had my title there is Trump, Brexit and Beyond. I will quickly go into some of the illustrations of the beyond. Let's start with Trump, which I think is obvious, the importance of the election of Trump in the United States. Here is the question: how could such a character, racist, sexist, xenophobic, liar, ignorant of most of the world, literally unable to understand issues as important as climate change, and ready to despise anyone at any point, a pathological narcissist, how he could be elected President of the United States, and how he has a strong nucleus of about 30% of the American electorate, solid, still today. Then if you add 10% of people who systematically vote Republican because they will die Republican, and whoever is the Republican, they will vote Republican, that creates a very solid basis, which in addition, I argue, is not an electoral basis only, but it's a movement. It's a movement. How this could happen? Yeah, some very simplistic notions that I hear in countries around the world, Latin America and South Africa. Of course, you know, Americans. Well, let me remind you that Americans elected twice a very progressive black president, not so long ago. Okay? So it's not genetic. And even if he lost to Hillary by 2 million votes in the popular vote, but his strategy was to focus on the swing states, and he won. But in addition, the most important thing, he defeated the two parties. He is not a Republican. Actually, he was technically a Democrat. He defeated first the Republican establishment and then the Democratic establishment. And then he insurged against the entire party system. That's why it's significant. So, what happened? Exactly. Empirical. Then we can discuss ideological if you want, but my role is to analyze. First, the campaign. What happened in the campaign? And I will go fast because many of you know perfectly through the media. He launched the campaign with a very spectacular declaration of anti-Mexican xenophobia. That's important because bang, that opened immediately the eyes to everybody. Mexicans, all Mexicans are rapists, criminals, and traffickers. 120 million people on the border of the United States. And he said what many people were thinking but could not say because of political correctness, and particularly with very few politicians would dare to say. Second theme, anti-globalization. Can you imagine? Yes. He took the mantra of anti-globalization and the critique of the globalization process and the global economy. In fact, he was cynical enough to also criticize Wall Street for making the financial crisis. That's his close friends. That changed later, but the anti-globalization rhetoric didn't. And he really believes that he has to fight globalization. Strange for a capitalist candidate these days, no? And he also campaigned, and still does, against American military presence in the world. Anti-globalization against American military bases is almost a left-wing program, right? And this from a tycoon, which is the ultimate real estate speculator and financial crook, several times in bankruptcy. So it starts for you to see how the traditional way of criticizing and establishing left, right, etc. didn't work in this case. So his media strategy was very savvy because he's a real estate tycoon and he was also a media guy. He knew some fundamental rule that we have established in communication research. The important thing in the media is to be in the media, not the content, why you are in the media. It's dichotomic. You are not. And that's the critical thing. And then the content depends because then people reinterpret the content. But he, because being outrageous from the very beginning, succeeded in having the entire country talking about him, which in addition favors and satisfies his narcissism. So, in the very first day of the campaign, electoral campaign, all the media were covering him, waiting for the next outrageous statement. That's, was very juicy. What he's going to say today. Extraordinary media strategy. Publicity without spending a penny in publicity. He spent very little. In fact, Hillary had twice as much funding as he and twice as many offices in the campaign. Hillary had a much, much bigger machine. But the key difference was that Trump was a movement. Meaning people devoted to him, campaigning for him, and no need to be paid or to be recruited. People were working for the ideals of this movement. We'll come in a second to which kind of movement. Hillary, in addition, did everything possible to lose the campaign. In addition, but then not important, particularly arrogance. Hillary was convinced again of something that is true, that is the most capable politician in the United States, the most intelligent, the best prepared, but it doesn't work this way. She committed the same mistake that with Obama. When she realized that people were going to vote for Obama, it was too late, because she thought that was obvious, how people are not going to take me. okay, I already accepted that my husband would go first, but of course, well, that led to arrogance and to some slippery statements, like when she said that in fact Trump voters were the deplorable. Deplorable. That goes directly into what the American elites, particularly the liberal elites, always thought about the uneducated masses of America. In fact, is what historically was called white trash. So for her, okay, this is white trash, but I will take the real, conscious, educated citizens, we'll see. In fact, the result of that is that even white women voted 52% for Trump. The notion that because women, Hillary was a woman, no, white women, I'm talking white women, black women, Latino women voted for Hillary. But white women, still the majority of women, voted 52% for Trump. Youth certainly were against Trump, but were completely demobilized and didn't dare to vote. By the way, it's similar to Brexit. Among other things, minority youth rejected to vote for Hillary because at the same time was a real social movement going on in the United States, Black Lives Matter, about the cops just killing anyone for being black and being in total impunity. Hillary defended the police in that controversy. The police, well, yes, they have to be constrained, but you have to understand the police is in dangerous situation. At that very moment, she lost a substantial proportion of the vote of the black youth. In addition, the Democratic National Committee and Hillary tricked the candidacy of Sanders, who was a progressive socialist Democrat that was anti-establishment. And a number of studies, although I cannot verify the rigor, argued that against an anti-establishment candidate as Trump, only another anti-establishment candidate as Sanders would have some chances. As it turned out, it was the anti-establishment candidate versus the most establishment politician in the United States, hand in with Wall Street, with the entire traditional political class, etc., etc. So then the establishment had a face, Hillary. The anti-establishment had a face, Trump. And then, of course, she made all these huge mistakes of using her personal email to deal with state business, but when she was Secretary of State. What has not been too much published, but yeah, there's some publication about that, is why. Is she stupid? No. She just did not know any usage other than BlackBerry. She always used BlackBerry and controlled BlackBerry, and so she used BlackBerry that by definition could not be encrypted because that was the most she was able to do in technology of communication. Second point I want to make on this. There was a Russian intervention in the campaign. Yes, it was. It's now established, has been proven. I wrote it a long time ago. There was a collusion with the Russians. All the first team from Trump were people who were themselves in direct connection with the Russians. All this is now coming to surface and documented and proven. Yes, the Russians participated in the massive hacking of the emails of Hillary and actually gave the emails to the Trump campaign. Not to Trump, to Trump's son and to Trump's son-in-law. Now it's acknowledged. Even Trump has acknowledged. He said, well, but that was not illegal. That's what all parties do, get information about the opponent by any means. Well, the any means were the KGB. So any means a little bit dubious. And the Russians were very active in the new electoral strategies. They were faster than anyone else. Now everybody is doing it. That is to intervene in the social networks, in the electronic social networks, Facebook and Twitter, etc., through robots, not through Russian students. No, robots. Thousands and thousands and thousands of robots that can be programmed to amplify certain message, to fake other messages. It's totally polluted now. Any electoral campaign, any political movement is, to a large extent, led in quantitative terms by robots. Now, all this is true, yet this did not decide the election. That's the point. And that's the empirical point. Why? Because we know which were the decisive factors that led to the vote for Trump. Which are these factors? Okay. Empirically, who voted for Trump? First, and most important, the most important variable, whites. Massive. That was a white vote against a minority vote. That was the important thing. Hillary lost among whites to Trump by 21 points of difference among whites. Obama also had lost, by the way, among whites, but only by 12 points. So Obama being black, Hillary lost by many, almost by double points vis-a-vis Trump among whites. Voted for Trump the non-college educated whites. So education was a key thing. Among less educated whites, meaning non-college, 75% voted for Trump versus 28% for Hillary. Huge. Even college whites, if they were whites, 49% Trump, 45% Clinton. Women, white non-college women, the less educated women, 58% for Trump. That's an important thing. A gender candidacy is not the decisive point. It has to be folded into a broader set of variables. Now, this white working class mobilization was absolutely decisive in the Midwest, where there are 40% of the voters of the United States, and they are in the key swing states. In these states, through the mobilization of white working class, Trump won by a proportion of 2-1. There has been some interpretation that that was the white working class hit by globalization. Yes, that's part of the issue. In fact, surveys showed that there was a high correlation between voting for Trump and a negative attitude toward international trade. So yes, you can say that's the case. But by far, the most statistically significant variable was, again, race. Not class, but race. Now, you combine race and class, yes, it's even more. Territorially, something very interesting. Hillary won by 13 million votes in the 100 most populated urban areas, the urban metropolitan vote. But in rural America, Trump won by 75% of the vote, amounting to about 12 million votes. So these 13 million, about high-level urbanites, were almost matched and destroyed as a critical mass by the massive mobilization of rural America, and particularly white rural America, for Trump. So there is extraordinary correlation between races and vote for Trump. The racists, of course, all voted for Trump, but the majority of Trump voters are not racist. That's, you see, one thing is to say there is a correlation, but the majority were not racist. And who are this majority who are not racist? Mainly older groups of the population, felt marginalized by globalization, yes, but also technology. being lost in technology, being furious against the cosmopolitanism of the elites, being threatened by immigration. The great sociologist Arlene Hochschild calls this group strangers in their own land. They are the majority, they are there, but no one talks about them. They are ignored. All the cosmopolitan elites are in strategies of the future, but they don't talk about them. Historian Walter Russell Mead, great historian of the United States, has published an incredible analysis of the Trump election in terms of identity. His analysis, rooted in observation but elaborated at a much higher level, relating to the Jacksonian movement, President Andrew Jackson at the beginning of the 19th century, that mobilized Americans, white Americans, against future immigration waves. But Russell Mead showed that now in the United States, and I would say in large part of the world, the dominant is the politics of identity. Everybody has an identity. Women have an identity, Latinos have an identity, blacks have an identity, gays and lesbians and transsexuals have an identity, young people have an identity, everybody has an identity, except white males. Because white males, this was the dominant group forever, so they don't have an identity, they are white males. So the key is that's Russell Mead's analysis, that Trump was able to mobilize the identity of white males as a reaction against all these groups that were in fact always at the forefront of the public debate and were the only ones with recognized identity. And Trump talked to these people. And his major ideological advisor, Steve Bannon, talked to these people and elaborated the theory of the revenge of the white males, and particularly working class. So white nationalism against both immigration, but also against the cosmopolitan elites of the big cities, local versus cosmopolitan, local versus global. That was the key chemistry in the movement. Bannon was truly the articulating ideologue and became the director of the campaign in August. Bannon, very interesting and complex personality, Marine, but graduate from Harvard, media tycoon, very rich self-made man in Los Angeles, and he literally constructed the nationalist identity of white Americans and connected to the militant alt-right that were completely marginal. The groups like Ku Klux Klan and company were just marginal, but bringing all them together until the bigger umbrella of the white nationalist identity that changed everything. By the way, Bannon went into really wanting and building a movement, entered in deep contradiction with the Trump family, what he calls Jabarta, meaning from Ivanka and Jared Kushner, her husband, and their cronies. That were the Russian influences with the family of Trump, and particularly with his daughter Ivanka, that Trump said several times that pity is my daughter, otherwise I would go out with her. So that's why Bannon clashed with Trump, because it's much more an ideologue, a nationalist movement against these cronies and these people who are just for money and to abuse the confidence of American people. So you see there are some new forms of contradiction. By the way, Bannon last week landed in Brussels with a lot of money to start the same thing in Europe, relating to all these other nice movements and governments that are now springing up in Europe. Additional factors. Trump has a diagnosed extreme narcissistic personality that leads to constant changes, dismissal of staff, therefore unpredictability, very difficult to classify, lies and counter-lies, development of fake news, and all the news that are not favorable become fake news for him. And then he tweets, tweet after tweet, night after night. It's a new way of government by Twitter, every night, and in the middle of the night, and it's not his staff, it's himself. So some people started to think about how this could be a symptom that could lead to his impeachment, not for reasons of being a crook, but for reasons of mental instability. Very difficult, very difficult. Besides the diagnosis, you know, all this impeachment stuff has to be voted by Congress with a two-thirds majority. And the Republicans would never do that, even if they hate Trump. But now their destiny is completely tied to Trump until something happens and Trump is dismissed for other reasons. Now, yes, in addition, he inherited a good economy, and then went immediately into the traditional conservative policies, economic policies, cutting social programs, including Obamacare, but not entirely because still debated, huge tax cuts, and concentrating all the cuts in punishing immigrants, minorities, and poor people. So that is okay with the white working class. That is the core of his support. In addition, the Democratic Party was and is in complete disarray because ultimately has concentrated the support among ethnic minorities, which are the only true democratic social base, which therefore increases the contradiction with the mainstream white working class, whites in general, that then are left to the most extreme tendencies in the Republican Party. Yes, there is now the beginning of an opposition to Trump, social movements. The key segments of the opposition are women, particularly after the Me Too movement. Immigrant rights movement is becoming very powerful, but these are movements, these are not still political parties or political options. Kids against guns, this is a huge movement, but the kids don't vote. Youth are coming back to be active against Trump, but they don't know whom to support in political terms. Gays, of course, they feel very threatened by Trump. And there is the beginning of some new politics in the United States. Particularly, the most important case is a young Latino woman, Puerto Rican, 28 years old, actually is a bartender in New York, Ocasio-Cortez, that in the primary of the Democratic Party in New York beat a traditional representative of the Democratic Party, Joe Crowley, very good guy, by the way, but traditional politician. And this woman was working for Sanders, and is certainly going to be elected in the Congress because this district is always Democratic. So there's some blimps here and there that these social movements translate into some slow renewal of the Democratic Party. But for the moment, the deepest significance of Trump election is the rupture of the political establishment, both Republican and Democratic, in favor of an outsider leading a white identity movement. I want to move quickly to Brexit, so for you to see to some extent, similarity. As you know, Brexit resulted from a referendum called by the Conservative Prime Minister Cameron to fulfill an electoral promise. Under the pressure of the Conservative side of the Conservative Party, he had promised in his campaign to finally call a referendum. And he kept his promise. Most politicians in Europe still blame him for doing that. What do you mean? You keep your electoral promise? That's so dangerous? But he actually was confident that he could win and then settle the issue, because he actively campaigned to remain in the EU, and he had the total support of everybody. The three political parties in England, Conservatives, Labour and Liberals, the three were for Remain. The entire business elite, the financial elite, the mainstream media, everybody was for Remain. Actually, there was a scare campaign, as most of you know. If we vote against the European Union, the economy will collapse, the city of London would close, everybody will go to Frankfurt. Well, nothing of this happened. And in spite of the three parties being fully mobilized for that, 60% of Conservatives and 40% of Labour voted for Brexit. Voted for Brexit precisely because the elites were for Remain. Voted for Brexit 54% of people in England, 51.9% in the UK because of Scotland, that is the most pro-European, very much similar, I will not talk about that, but similar to Catalonia or the Basque Country in Spain. The more you are nationalist in your country, the more you are for the European Union to get rid of your nation state. Now, again, like in the case of the Americans, people say, well, sure, but Brits always have been traditionally Eurosceptics. Well, except that in 1975, they voted overwhelmingly to join the European Union. So something has changed, right? Both in the United States and in the UK. The key theme of Brexit was not racism like the United States, was not the whiteness at all. The key was expressed in a slogan, take back control of the country, literally. That was the statement. Take back control. Concretely means borders. And symbolically, I would say, also resonated with taking back control of your lives, of our lives, that were being transformed without control by the speed of change and in multidimensional terms, again, from technology to globalization to institutions. The speed of change, oh, it goes too fast, let's slow down, let's rethink, let's close the door and be home and then think. Hey, elites, stop doing all this kind of huge transformation without consulting, without telling us, without telling anything. That was the key issue. Because it was not racism, because the opposition in Britain was not to third world immigrants or to refugees at the time, was to European immigrants, was against Poles, against Romanians, against people in the European Union that because of the belonging to the European Union, they have the rights to live and use social services and work in the UK. That was literally the cause. In fact, since 2004, under Blair's policy, 1.5 million Europeans, but mainly Eastern Europeans, have come to the UK and were competing for jobs, for services, for housing, for health, very important, for education. And this was aggravated by the crisis, the financial crisis and the economic crisis, in which there were more cuts linked to austerity policies. These austerity policies inspired by whom? Germany, that imposed austerity policies all over the European Union as a remedy against the crisis, different from Obama, who did the contrary, did a neo-Keynesian policy of expanding the state intervention. So immigrants are there, European immigrants. Cuts are imposed by Germany, and therefore fewer jobs, fewer services, fewer everything, and there are all these people who are not British and who are taking our services and our jobs. Empirically, by the way, what happens is that since there is no common European identity, this is one of the topics that I have studied. I just published a 4 years research project called Europe's Crisis, showing all the data about why the crisis and why Europe cannot manage the crisis and could split. And it's very simple. If there is no European identity, and there is none, when things are okay, then yeah, it's okay to be European. When there is a serious crisis and you have to share, and you have to share resources and policies and suffering, why me German with the Greeks? Actually, a very revealing thing was the Minister of Finance of the Netherlands, socialist by the way, they stated openly and publicly, we should not help the southern countries because these people spend every money we give them in alcohol and women. And that's what profoundly they think. Maybe yes, but it wouldn't be such a bad idea, not women, men as well, but I mean, if everything is ending, well, to have a last good time. So, who actually voted for Brexit is, again, you can see the profile. All people older than 65. The industrial working class voted 63% versus 44% the middle class for Brexit. Whites, yes, but not decisively. And interesting, residents of the cities and regions distant from London voted for Brexit. London voted against. Immigrants are in London. They are not in Newcastle. So the rejection was the notion of losing control over the borders, not the hatred of the immigrant in the next door. Gender was not a factor, although men were slightly more for Brexit, that was not a factor. And here is the key. Less educated people, meaning like non-college, voted for Brexit 30 points more than the college educated. Why? Because the surveys are very conclusive in that sense. They don't feel prepared to compete in the world, and they are right. While all the thriving financial elites and media elites and academic elites are happy. Hey, we are just can go on the world. Everything is going to be peaceful and wonderful, and we will talk to our friends all over. These people were totally for Brexit, so against Brexit. The less educated did not feel equipped to compete or be in a global world. So British elites clearly declared themselves citizens of the world. For Brexit were they left behind by globalization. It is not class, it's centrality and marginality, it's a different thing. Of course, then the criticism of Brussels as a distant, powerful technocracy that is not democratic, and fundamentally three concurrent factors that interacted synergistically. A crisis of legitimacy of politicians and political parties in general. This is the general crisis also in Britain. The crisis of legitimacy of the European Union, which exists in every country but particularly in Britain. And then the social crisis linked to austerity policies, linked partially to Germany. The three crises interacted in producing Brexit. Beyond, well, a large part of Europe, actually I would say the majority at this moment, is being taken over by xenophobia and extreme nationalism. The key example is Italy, the great Italy, in which two parties were elected together in government, and actually the Movimento Cinque Stelle, which is more ambiguous in that, but then the Lega Nord, a literally fascist group, rooted in the north of Italy, but explicitly based on xenophobic, anti-immigration, and nationalistic themes. They were the ones, they have a leader, which reveres Mussolini, and Matteo Salvini, and Matteo Salvini is now the Minister of Interior, but the dominant force and the dominant voice in that coalition government. Just to give you a little example, he was the one who closed the Italian ports to all the refugees that were wandering in the Mediterranean, and he went on television and justified it. Italy is not going to accept any more human flesh. Literal words. Refugees are human flesh, not humans, human flesh. It was the short term compensated because the new Socialist Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, opened the Spanish ports and went immediately to see Merkel how things can be stopped, but this is a dominant factor. Poland, as I told you, Hungary, Viktor Orban, an extreme nationalist leader who, in order to stop any possibility of Hungarian NGOs being helpful to refugees or to the world, has imposed a new 25% tax on NGOs who help other people in the world. No, it's serious what's happening. And then the new Prime Minister of Austria, Kurz, with in alliance, Conservative Party, in alliance with the parties, the neo-Nazi parties, has moved Austria to the extreme right, and is currently, these next 6 months, he is the current president of the entire European Union. And yes, we used to say in all these crises, etc., humanitarian, yeah, but there is Scandinavia. At least there is Scandinavia. Well, Finland and Norway have governments that include an alliance between a conservative party and a xenophobic party, explicitly xenophobic. Particularly in Finland, the True Finns party. True Finns, it's very clear. And how the True Finns party was created. In 2012, in an election, this party was formed from nowhere. And in one election went from 0 to 20%. One slogan only in the electoral campaign: do not help Portugal. Why poor little Portugal? Well, because at that time was being discussed the bailout, and that was 2010, the bailout of Portugal. So by focusing on no money for Portugal, they meant what they meant. Norway, Denmark, the government does not include the xenophobic party, but the xenophobic party is critical in the parliamentary support for that government. And I could go on and on and on, unfortunately. Then, as I told you before, the European Union may not survive, literally, because all these new parties, supported by a large part of the European public opinion, they refuse to share with any other in trouble, and certainly share with anyone in the world. No identity, no common identity, no common policies. It's as simple as that. Latin America, as I told you, Brazil is falling apart. If former and legendary President Lula continues to be in prison, unfairly in prison, under charges of corruption and sentenced to 12 years. The current presidential elections in November, the current leading person in this presidential election is called Bolsonaro, who is a former military officer who is campaigning to return to the military dictatorship in Brazil. And he has the leading position in the polls. Well, I'm not going to tell you about African governments. You know that as much as I know, as much I have talked to colleagues, etc., practically all African governments are run by corruption and by corruption mafias. And in South Africa, with all the revelations about Zuma, you were not doing too well. Fortunately, you have a good judiciary and a good press, but in terms of government, you already had been submerged in a major crisis of legitimacy. When I was trying to prepare this lecture, I read Sunday's newspaper, and I saw this wonderful social policy of President Zuma, that he was appropriating the cattle that the government was giving to poor peasants in the Eastern Cape. stealing cattle from the poor. I mean, I cannot imagine a lower level of humanity. And so all this for what? Where it comes from? Just headlines. First, the formation and consolidation throughout the world, or what some Italian analysts were made famous by calling it the casta. The casta is the professional political class that embraces all ideologies, all parties, and they have one principle: everything within our circle, within the world of institutional politics. And yet, once we are there, we close the door and we see who wants, who can win, who cannot, the coalition. But first, let's close the influence to anyone who doesn't enter the political system. For this, electoral laws, tricks, regulations, etc. Because the barbarians are at the gates. There are many social movements bumping on these closed doors of the casta. The emergence of a new kind of politics, which I have analyzed in my book, Communication Power, which basically linked to informational politics, that is use of big data and other techniques to manage political processes, to media politics. Media politics means that no politics outside the media can function. Only media politics exists as politics, which leads to the simplest message in a media world, which is a human face. Means to lead to the personalization of politics. The leader, but not the color, the tie. No, actually the character that is conveyed by one particular personality. And because this, the key mechanism for this is the establishment of trust, of a trust relationship between that leader and the and citizens at large. The key way to fight in politics today is to destroy the opponent by destroying the trust through scandal politics, creating a scandal. Fake scandal? No, because there's so much dirt in the political system that anyone can easily find some dirt against the other. It's a business actually, something called, companies called Operation Research. Which was defined by one of their leaders, sorry the expression, said, well, basically our business, we are rat fuckers. We just try to destroy, and anyone can pay us and we can work for one or the other. The key thing is to find enough dirt to destroy the other through scandals. And the media cooperate simply because scandals sell. Not that they are particularly anti-democracy, no, the scandals sell. And then, of course, everybody uses, because not to use that means you are going to be beaten for sure. So since everybody uses the same, then even I have shown in my research that not all scandals work against the person object of the scandal. For instance, Clinton, after all his great lies and etc. with the famous intern at the White House, still, he, in spite of all the scandal, people had great sympathy for him. And they ended up in his presidency with a high mark of approbation. When people were asked about that, he said, yeah, he's a corrupt and a liar, but all are, and he's our liar. But you understand that, yes, he can be safe, other people not, but what suffers from all this is not one person or one party, it's the entire credibility of the entire political system. And then what comes here is that this politics, this informational politics, is very expensive. It's very expensive. You have to buy everybody, you have to do media politics, you have to do social networks. It's extremely expensive. And so, all parties, all leaders need to accumulate huge amounts of capital to finance this particular type of politics. And because they do that, all parties, all in the entire world, are illegally financed. They are all in illegality. Every country that's happening. There, frankly, I still would say the Scandinavian countries, even the xenophobic parties. I think there is still a slimmer of civility, even if they are extreme right. But in general, they are all illegally financed, and therefore this opens the way to corruption, and corruption opens to the politics of scandal, and to do that then you have to use all this media, which makes it more expensive, and so on, you know the argument. The use of state power to accumulate for party and for politicians. One of the key elements in many countries in the world is the use of regulatory power in exchange of favors and finance, and the milking of public enterprises, which has been the case particularly in Latin America. Corruption politics, which is the media politics, scandal politics, corruption politics. And corruption politics leads to the judicialization of the political process. Ultimately, the verdict is in the courts. So who wins in the courts wins. So everything has to be set up not to convince the citizens, to convince the judges. That's the ultimate form of politics. That therefore bypasses the democratic process. And ultimately, social networks are autonomous source of communication. I have been, last time I presented a book here at STIAS, was of my book, Networks of Outrage and Hope, about the transformative role of the social networks and social movement based on the internet. Now I have to correct something. Yes, this is a space of autonomy, therefore it actually has expanded citizen participation, has democratized the control of societies over political system, but at the same time, in the social networks is everybody. All the extreme right, all the liars, all the cheaters, not just the wonderful, nice social movements, blue eyes toward the horizon. And therefore, everything that happens in the social networks, which is really the main system of communication nowadays, is built on autonomy of these social networks, which means also autonomy to spread fake news, autonomy to launch xenophobic campaigns, etc. Internet is not separated from who we are, and we are not necessarily angels. We are angels and devils at the same time. And not one is angel, all of us, inside, we have the two. And it depends which button you activate. And all this in a period of globalization and uncontrolled technological change for a period of fear and uncertainty. And so I will finish with my synthesis for all this with a poem. A poem from Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, which could be applied to what I describe, could be applied to democracy. And it says, it's very short, not what it could have been. It is what it was. And what it was is dead. Thank you for your attention.
So, Manuel has agreed for a few questions or comments from the floor. I think we can do about 10-15 minutes maximum, and if you have any questions or comments, he's also indicated that he would like a few to be asked, and then he will take notes and then respond afterwards.
Yeah,
if someone can help with the roving mic, because I think if you switch this on. Yeah, I'll start with this gentleman, but I see I recognize that hand, and then over here. Perhaps just introduce yourself, and then.
My name is Carlson Yangwei. I come from Victoria. I've listened to a great deal of passion, your presentation, which has excited me a lot. You've touched on very many issues, pressure of the American election. Not excited about that. But my question I want to ask related to Brexit. You did mention that the reason why London voted was because of the immigrant element in London. I want to suggest that we look at the Midlands, the UK, a lot of immigrants there that way as well. So I don't think it was so decisive, the immigrant community in London that turned the vote. What we hear the media was saying, actually, what turned the vote came from Wales. Interesting. And of course, that supports your theory. Why Wales? Because Wales is generally poor. And the campaign in Wales was that, take back your life, as you say. Take back your life. Because they felt they were marginalized, and the Brits felt, at least the Welsh, even though they have a lot of support from Europe, in many projects, they felt that, well, their lives are actually in their control in Europe and not in the UK.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the two questions. I'm just going to go here, it's closer, and then a couple of gentlemen.
Yes, I'm Joachim Safsberg. I'm a fellow, great honor, and thank you for your talk. I very much agree in large parts with your diagnosis of the current situation. What I would like you to spend maybe a couple of minutes on is to tell us where the vicious circle that you seem to have outlined might lead us. What will the world look like 20 years down the road if indeed the tendencies, the trends that you diagnosed will continue? And the second part of the same question maybe is, are there any ways out of the disaster that these tendencies might lead us to? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gentlemen over here.
Thank you. My name is Tukumbi Kasongo from Democratic Republic of Congo, but I am also an immigrant in the US and fellow here. Your lecture was comprehensive, really comprehensive, and I can agree more. One thing that I think that is missing, that I am curious to know why it was missing, is the religious dimension of the campaign in the U.S. The role of evangelical churches, that was missing, and I'm curious to know about that. Because even when the Trump is making all mistakes, I think he can count on the core of evangelical organizations. And related to that is the role or what he perceived as evil coming from Islam. Islam was very central to his categorization and his association with Arabs, with Africans, and I think that the mission was very much clear that he was making everything that is coming out of Africa or Middle East Islam, and Islam is bad. So I'm curious to know about that, because I think that he was able to mobilize the people because the people wanted to make sure that Islam is not American. And the last is about the optimism. And I believe that what definitely is coming out is that we are moving towards some kind of multipolarity. Maybe in the next 200 or so, maybe more, that the world is moving towards multipolarity. And I believe in that based on what I see in social movements, indigenous movements, coming out of South America and coming out also of in Africa. And I seem to believe that unipolar system that either being pushed by, being erased by China and all now defeated the US system, that all this unipolarity is going nowhere, and that we are gradually, slowly moving towards multipolarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Manuel, do you want to respond to these three? Do you want to respond to these three?
Yeah. To these three questions? Okay.
Yeah. I haven't seen any other hands.
All right. Well, first, in terms of the specific point about the English referendum, you're absolutely right. And there were points in those regions and areas in which there was a clear benefit from the European Union transfer for depressed regions. There was support for the European Union. In that's absolutely right. But the most surprising thing for me is that there is a negative correlation entre regions that were immigrants, European immigrants, I'm talking about European immigrants, were more present, therefore were regions that in fact voted to remain, particularly London. And that's interesting. So the rejection of European immigrants was more in the general imaginary of the people than in the face-to-face interaction with people in certain cities. So it was really the notion of control. But you're absolutely right, particularly in Wales, although this I don't have evidence, just comments from some people. Wales, like the Scotland, has less than Scotland, but has a nationalist movement below the nation state. And as I said, this is a general trend. If any region or nation that feels that should be given breathing space from their own nation states is for Europe, hoping that Europe will save them, which I think is a misplaced hope, certainly in the case of Catalonia, but in any case, that's one of the reasons. You are absolutely right that I didn't emphasize the role of evangelical churches in the U.S. campaign, mainly because I was looking at the structural causes and I did socio-demographic analysis rather than going into the actors. But yes, religion in general, and evangelicals in particular in the case of the United States and in other countries, in Latin America, etc., are a key force. That's what I said. Religion is expanding fast throughout the world. I think the basic data is in 1990 there were 82% of people who were believers of some religion, and now it's 92%. But the established churches are going down. And Islam is expanding, you're absolutely right, and evangelicals are expanding. Now, that means what? That means that in a situation of uncertainty, as I mentioned, and in a situation in which the institutions of the civil society and institutions of the state are distrusted, then people go back to identities and particularly to refusing religion, but not the religions that are already linked to the institution that they are rejecting. And this is absolutely spectacular in the case of Latin America. The Catholic Church in Brazil was 98% 20 years ago. Now evangelicals have taken 27% of the Brazilian population, and they're absolutely decisive in a number of elections, and they are growing. So let's say that we have increasingly to establish a difference between institutionalized religion and religion. And even if we know that evangelical groups, many of them are literally racketeers, taking money from people and manipulating them, etc., even if it is so, but still they raise some hope from people, and people are ready to pay. Are ready even to pay poor people finance. In Nigeria, for instance, is spectacular, the rise of evangelicals, etc. So you're absolutely right. And then Islam is the one religion that holds, and to some extent is part of this attempt to provide a new identity that in the moment in which everything is disintegrating. Now, precisely because of that, there is the Western state institutions are increasingly anti-Islamic. And that contradiction is adding to the tensions that we live in our society. Multipolarity, well, can be understood in different terms. If multipolarity is considered in geopolitical terms, yes, there is a tendency to diminish the power of the United States as a major power, mainly because of the nationalist reaction in the United States, refusing to follow the policies of the Democrats and going back into the tradition, the big debate at the origins of the American nation between Hamilton and Jefferson and the people who were for being the leaders of the new world, and people say, wait a second, let's be home, and then we organize things for us first. So Trump, in that sense, is withdrawing and represents, even if he ends his presidency, of course, the movement is toward relative, what I would say, relative isolationism. Isolation is as long as no basic interests are affected. But yes, America is retrenching to a large extent and doesn't care too much about hegemony, about being the role model of the world, no. Because of that, other countries, and particularly China, are filling the void. And the most spectacular case is in in Latin America, in which the United States used to be dominant everywhere, and it's not at all the case anymore. China is absolutely key for the economic development of Latin America. Now, most of the agribusiness exports, which are critical, go to China and, in broader terms, to Asia, not to the United States. And the dominance of the United States is mainly financial, but even there is disputed by both the Spanish and German banks. So yes, in that sense, if by multipolarity we understand that the United States is losing relative weight in terms of the power and influence in the world, that's absolutely the case. If we consider, but you include what you say, the social movement, that's a different matter. Because then social movements are increasingly submitted to the pressure of states in their home countries, for instance, and the pressure of international interest. Just to be clear, the key example, Brazil. 2013, there was a massive social movement in Brazil, progressive to change democracy, etc. 2015 was a massive movement, social movement in Brazil, against the streets, internet, etc., extreme right, and financed by the Koch brothers, the billionaires of ultra-conservative origin. So again, here the notion of social movements are being the saviors of humankind has sometimes yes, sometimes not, and it depends. And therefore, I would say multipolarity in geopolitical terms, yes. Multipolarity in terms of multiple actors that reshape the world in different ways, that would be my personal hope, but I don't see it as yet. And then I come to Joachim's point about showing the vicious circle and how to get out of there, and what is the future, and what the future would be if we do not stop all this disaster. Well, because it's you, I will answer. Usually my specialty around the world is to frustrate people. I feel myself in the condition of, as a citizen, I'm very concerned everywhere. But I always tend to do my analysis and then confront people to the reality of their dire reality, and then you solve the problem if you can. I think so. But again, I say I will elaborate one moment on this very quickly. The other thing is that we do not have the methodology at all to not only predict but even understand the development of the future, and particularly now. I gave you today, because I value so much my wall in Stellenbosch, I gave you today the optimistic version of my talk. Because my real version ends up with something else. We are in the Camanchaca. That everybody understands what I mean right now. Camanchaca is a Quechua word that refers to a very deep fog in the Andes, a special one. Is dark, is black actually, not white. Is very thick and has been formed by a number of phenomena that ultimately makes it toxic and goes into your lungs, and you cannot breathe, and you cannot see, and you don't know where you are, and you go crazy. I am writing a book with my great friend, the sociologist in Latin America, Fernando Calderón, who is from Bolivian origin, and we use that word to describe the situation in Latin America nowadays. That's the worst thing, because when you are in the Camanchaca, and as I think we may be, it's nothing there, because you don't see anything. What to do, how to do. You move this way, you move that way. 5 years ago, only 5 years ago, there were all kinds of hopes in Latin America, which are being lost now. There were 10 years ago, were all kinds of hopes in the solidarity of the European Union. In the United States, Obama had recreated a number of things. And the changes are not just political changes, reflect the despair, the confusion, and the decomposition that is happening in society. So that's why it's very difficult to see beyond this Camanchaca. However, now, do I see beams of light here and there? Yes. Because all my life, my real topic all my life has been social movements. But first I demystify that social movements are nice guys always, no, and depends. But anyway, my real hope is that I see the embryos of new values being created, not necessarily in the political system, although it does affect ultimately the political system. And there is the hope. Which are those values? Which are those trends? Most important for me, the women movement. Most important. And this is not demagogic. It's really, in a few years, the consciousness of women in the world has been transformed. The Me Too movement, and by the way, Thursday is Women's Day here, the Me Too movement has made a huge impact. It started of all places, as you know, in Hollywood, the creators of all the sexist images of the world. And now, all the Hollywood producers, directors, actors are under the table. Not anymore under the bed, under the table. Because they are terrified, they are losing their careers, etc., simply because women at one point said no. And this is happening everywhere. Fortunately, there is one interesting example in my country of origin, Spain. For the first time, the new socialist government has appointed 2/3 of the ministers are women, in all the key positions, in defense, in economy, finance. There are a number. Macron in France has declared that the most important thing in his presidency is going to be to give power to women. Well, women will take it rather than being given. But that is a huge thing, because it has different values. Has the values that not, of course, nothing biological, historical values of nurturing, values of taking care of people, values which is not about domination and war. Women always have been at the cutting edge of the peace movement everywhere throughout history, because they produce the children that they are killed. What is this? So there is an important element. Second, there is also a youth rebellion around the world. Not always progressive in political terms, but is in terms of creating the autonomy of the youth vis-a-vis the establishments that they have been polluting our societies. The environmental consciousness. Yes, there are jerks like Trump who refuse to take care of that, but millions and millions of people are at this point being personally, environmentally conscious. So social movements are permeating down. I would say pessimism, but my harsh realism concerns the political institutions. I believe in society. I believe in humans. At this point, we cannot really trust the political systems that we have been building and with some such pain to avoid dictatorships, etc., etc. This model of liberal democracy is not working in relationship particularly to the new hopes, to the new movement, to the new actors that emerge all over in society. So that connection is what is missing. And the way to connect and to prosper to a new kind of institutions is different in every country. That's why I can see methodologically there is the crisis of a model, but the reconstruction and supersession of this model depends on specific historical, cultural conditions in every country. And what has to happen, or is happening in Africa, let alone South Africa, is not the same thing that was happening in Italy, or in Spain, or in Latin America. That's why specificity is fundamental, and that's why for those of us social scientists interested in detecting the embryos of change, we have to be truly multicultural. And I don't say global. I have been called the first global sociologist. No, I am multi-local. It's very different. I feel deeply rooted and empathetic in South Africa, in Latin America, in Spain. So in every place, I find connections. And in these connections, what I am now convinced is that there is a reconstruction possible, but starting from society that then will eventually filter not down but up to the institutions. Thank you.
I know that there are a number of hands, but we also have to take into account the food that's getting cold, which is a really very important issue. Also,
that's a good incentive to finish the discussion.
Yeah, I didn't say that earlier, Manuel, to give you enough time. But let me ask you to thank Manuel again, and then I'm going to hand back to Hendrik for a final announcement. Thank you very much, Manuel.
I anticipated what I called a razor-sharp data-driven analysis, Manuel, and thank you for giving us precisely that. Even though you left us with a rather bleak picture, thank you for also showing us your optimistic side and for articulating so clearly where you see that a new set of values may be emerging from and where we can put our hope in. Thank you very much. At this stage, I want to acknowledge the support that STIAS has been receiving from the Donald Gordon Foundation and by name Wendy and Hilton Applebaum over many years, support which has put us in a position to continuously invite Manuel to join us here at STIAS, so thank you to them. Johan has already let the cat out of the bag, so I want to invite you to join us for a glass of wine and some refreshments. We cannot guarantee that either the rain has stopped or that the traffic has dissolved itself, so it may be a good idea to spend a few more minutes with us and let those two issues take care of themselves by the time that you finally leave. Thank you for joining us again.